Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into pretty much whatever platform you're watching on. They'll show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly, assuming that you're watching live. There may be a couple of platforms that don't do that. I'm not entirely sure, but the vast majority of them do. And I love to hear from you. And today, our subject is going to be the energy centers of the Earth, vortices and meridians. But first, I hope that you joined me yesterday for our eclipse ritual. I thought it was a lovely ritual, and it directly ties into and in fact is the reason I decided on today's subject, because we were working with the crystal web, which directly interacts in the manner of vortices and meridians. And also part of the ritual, and hello to Antonio in the chat room, it's good to see you, Antonio, was to revitalize the Corellian homeland, the area of Danville, Illinois, and Vermilion County. This is where the Corellian tradition developed. It has always been our heartland, our homeland, and we're hoping to see prosperity return to it and an increasing Corellian presence in it. Again, and those who have been with us for a long time will remember that this area was quite hopping some years in the past. But activity has slowed down a bit over the years, and I mean that both in terms of metaphysics and the local economy. I'm hoping that both will revitalize. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. Hello to Janet in the chat room. Good to see you, Janet. So part of that ritual was to see a rebirth in those things, also a rebirth in all of our lives. Because to me, that eclipse energy does involve letting go of old things as the light of the sun disappears, but also rebirth as the light of the sun is reborn. So we focused heavily on that. So if you did not join us for that, you can still see it. It is still in our archives, where it will hopefully remain forever, or at least for a very long time. Hello to Christine in the chat room. Good to see you, Christine. Um, Today I wanted to talk about vortices and meridians. And I guess I will start with my contemporary understanding of what these things are, which I think is a pretty common understanding. One of the things I try to do is to make sure that I'm giving you reasonable information. I do sometimes point out I'm speaking to my own understanding or my own background. But generally speaking, if I talk about something like ley lines, um, vortices, etc., if you go out and do your own research, you'll find pretty much the same things I'm saying, and I encourage you to do so. Don't just take my word for it. There are times where um, I may not agree with the common wisdom, and I will point that out and why. But generally speaking, I think you will find that the things that I say are not just my personal point of view, but do tend to reflect the wider understanding of these subjects. So, regarding vortices and meridians, a vortex is one of the energy centers of the Earth. And this is around a particular location. It is something that you should be able to feel just by going there, at least if you're sensitive to energy. Even if you're not, you should still feel it, but maybe not understand what it is. And as a general rule, vortices put off a great deal of energy that can be used in different ways depending on the exact nature of the energy. And Christine says, it was a beautiful ritual. I buried a crystal and I'm now part of the crystal web. What an amazing feeling. Thank you, Christine. I'm glad that you enjoyed it and glad to have you do that. And I think you'll find the energy is quite amazing. And it's an example of the kind of energy we're talking about with vortices and ley lines slash meridians. When you go to a vortex. As a metaphysical worker, you would draw on that energy, either to refresh your energy or to use it in various forms of meditation or magic. And again, it does tend to depend to some extent on which vortex we're talking about, exactly what kind of energy you will find there. Hello to Jason in the chat room. These vortices are then connected by ley lines or meridians. And hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. Um, and these meridians run from one vortex to another. And people generally perceive them as straight lines, but we're going to come back to that. And these lines, these ley lines, work in much the same way as the vortices themselves, in that they generate certain kinds of energy. And anything that is located along those lines is going to be affected by that energy. And for this reason, many historical spiritual sites are located either at vortices or along the ley lines, the meridians that run between them. And also, many modern um, locations tend to cluster around these areas as well, because people feel the energy that comes from them, whether they're aware of what they're feeling or not. And if you're wanting to do strong metaphysical workings, being at a vortex or along a meridian can be very helpful to do this. Um, Now, I mentioned earlier that people tend to perceive the ley lines or the meridians as being straight lines. And that, I think, is how most people think of them, but that's not necessarily the case. Um, the ley lines come in two forms. They come in the straight form. They also come in a curvilinear form. And in Asia, the art of working with these energies is very old. And there they are called lungmai, or dragon lines. And these straight lines are considered to be yang lines. They produce energy. The curvilinear lines are yin lines that tend to absorb energy. Um, and you'll have a very different effect depending on which one you're working with. The straight lines tend to be more surface lines. The curvilinear lines tend to be um, under the surface, more subterranean lines, and often associated with underground water. And their general energy is very much like that of water. So they can be very good for psychic purposes, for example. But I think there's a lot less experience of people working with the yin lines. And hello to Rev Michael in the chat room. In terms of Western thought, I mentioned in Eastern thought, working with these earth energies is quite an old concept, and it's very much part of things like feng shui and other Eastern metaphysical arts. But in the West, the concept of ley lines and the term ley line comes from a man named Alfred Watkins, who was writing, I believe, in the 1920s. And he was not originally writing about metaphysics at all. He thought he discovered an archaeological phenomenon. And what he did is he basically looked at the locations of ancient sites in Europe and found that they aligned in a geometric manner. And he thought this was because they connected trade routes that ancient people had used. So for him, the concept of ley lines was a purely physical thing dealing with ancient people's travel. However, metaphysical writers took this idea and, of course, saw it differently. It was Diane Fortune, I believe, in particular, who understood this first in an energetic manner. And she wrote about it um, as the energetic connection of these ancient sites. And of course, Alfred Watkins' original idea that these were some sort of ancient trade routes was absolute nonsense, as subsequent archaeology made quite clear. And the understanding of these things in an energetic sense became the dominant point of view relatively quickly. Um, and the understanding based on Asian studies of yin and yang lines uh, followed around the Second World War. And it was M. Lewis Merle and Reginald Allender Smith who who particularly introduced this concept to Western thought. And I think that in working with ley lines, it is important to understand that there are both yang and yin lines, um, lines that are, I hate to say positive and negative because people so misunderstand that term negative in concert concepts like this. Um, but I think that yang and yin work maybe a little better for it, but that each one has its own properties and are used in very different ways. And in addition, each individual one has its own individual characteristics. So, in working with vortices and ley lines, you must be mindful that it's not so universal that it's always going to be the same. You have to pay attention to where you are, to the spirit of place. This is true when working with stones, and I was speaking about this sometime recently. That when you work with a stone has certain stereotypical properties. For example, um, I don't know if this is going to photograph properly, but a green stone such as a malachite is very good for prosperity, very good for growth, very good for expansion. Um, and the individual green stones have further differences between them, but your individual malachite may differ somewhat depending on its individual energy. And so, simply because this is the normal way the stone would be used, might not mean it's the best way to use a particular malachite. They vary. One of the big differences between a natural stone and a lab created stone, which is still natural in its own way, and also various synthetic stones um, like goldstone, which we talked about the other day, is that the natural ones are going to be far more idiosyncratic. They are going to be much more focused on their individual energies, whereas the lab grown or artificial stones are going to be a lot closer to that stereotypical purpose because they're so much younger and they haven't had a long period of development. So if you're looking for one that you want to use in a very stereotypical way, the lab created ones or even the synthetic ones are going to be much more predictable in that way, whereas a natural stone will have a lot more individuality. This is true too for vortices and ley lines. They do differ between one another. They are not all the same. And Christine says, I had dowsing rods years ago, but I wasn't sure how to use them, but they were cool. Dowsing is an old technique used to locate things like ley lines or vortices, also to find underground water, which again is associated with yin ley lines. And what you do when you're dowsing, you can use it with a pendulum, you can use it with a dowsing stick, or you can use it with dowsing rods, is that they will move basically of their own accord when they find what is being looked for. The same way that a pendulum will move, for example, in reaction to a question. So um, if you still have them or you want to try them again, that's basically what you do. You relax, you hold them, you go looking for what you're looking for, and they'll tell you when you found it, in the same way that you would use a pendulum. Now, having said all of this about vortices and ley lines, and continuing the thought I was just speaking about with stones, it is important to bear in mind that there are natural vortices and natural ley lines between them, and there are artificial vortices and ley lines which have been created through use. We were talking about this maybe yesterday, maybe Friday, in lead up to the eclipse ceremony, because we were talking about the crystal web. And the crystal web is a series of artificial vortices and ley lines. They are created intentionally, energetically, and they function in a lot of ways the same way that natural vortices and ley lines function, except that we interact with them a lot more and a lot more intentionally than people normally do with natural vortices and ley lines. And and Jason says, like the crystal web, absolutely. Um, but this is not the only way that a vortex can be artificially creative. And Mary says, I love the crystal web. And I do too. I find it immensely useful. And it is certainly the largest psychic engine ever created in the history of metaphysics. There is nothing comparable to it that I know of, at least in the real history of metaphysics. In fiction, you may find other things. Um, but other ways that you can artificially create a vortex, whenever we create a magic circle, we are creating basically a kind of vortex, but it is of a very limited duration. And when we take it down, we usually will ground that energy. But say, for example, you have a long term temple where you're not taking down and grounding your energy. Over time, that will create a vortex in its own right. Um, if you have a place where lots of people are coming together to do particular things, it will create a vortex over time imbued with the energy of those people. It creates an energetic pattern, which continues even when the people are no longer there. Um, and as with the crystal web, when you intentionally create an energetic engine and set it up so that it goes continually, you're creating a vortex. Many of these are very small, and any crystal web access point is a very small vortex compared to the natural vortexes, natural vortices that we think about around the world. Although, in addition to the big ones, there are small ones too, but we rarely think about those. But when you put them all together, they're quite remarkable. But as an individual thing, it's a tiny little vortex. But that doesn't mean it's not a vortex. Also, we've talked about how in daily life we all put out energy and receive energy on a regular basis, and how a particular location can receive a charge from things that happen in it. And the great archetypal example of that is probably the Amityville house, which is a highly dubious example, but it's one that I think most people are familiar with. The idea that a house can take a negative charge because negative things have happened there. And conversely, it can also take um, a positive charge. And under certain circumstances, that can become an ongoing vortex. And hello to Jeanette in the chat room. Hello to Jennifer in the chat room. And Jennifer says, I'm very new to the practice, 3 years steadily, but have dabbled with it my whole life and have always been interested in the energy involved. There is so much information out there that it can become overwhelming. Any suggestions on the best place I can find reliable resources? Um, well, I'm a little biased, so I would say read my books. um, but also, read many different things and get some experience and apply what you learn in your experience to what you're reading. Because you're right, there are many different things out there, and there are a lot of people who've written a lot of nonsense. There are a lot of people who say a lot of nonsense. My general feeling is the oogie boogier that it is, the more sensational or frightening it is, the more likely you should just write it off. Janet points out Witch School, of which I am a co-founder, is an incredible resource. Yes, I would recommend you to Witch School, witchschool.com. And I think that you will find that it has very good resources for learning about energy. Um, it is the largest school of magic and metaphysics in the world. And I, Ed the Pagan, and Lisa Tuitt co-founded it 23 years ago, I think it is. Long time ago. And it's still going. And offers many wonderful classes. Jason says William Randall um, uh, created the Reiki World Peace Grid. Um, yeah, I generally recommend things like Reiki and pranic healing and sources that might be connected to those things. And as a general rule, my attitude is the calmer and more reasonable the source, the more likely it is to be reliable. If it tells you that you should be afraid of everything that you're touching, it's nonsense, leave it alone. If it tells you there are things you should be cautious about, that's another matter. But there are a lot of people who trade in fear, and I'm not unaware of the fact that if I chose to approach things that way, I'd probably get a lot more views. It seems to move people a lot more than legitimate information does. But I'm not really willing to do that, at least not in an instructional manner. Um, I've thought about doing a show of Reverend Don investigates haunted objects, but I suspect people would be very disappointed because half the time I'm probably going to say, yeah, this is not haunted. Um, don't know what you're thinking. But an example of nonsense is the idea of haunted dolls, which you'll find all over the place today. And there are people who think and have said that dolls are the most common thing to be haunted um, or cursed or what have you. And this is generally speaking nonsense. If you look at the history of hauntings, dolls are basically not there. I'm not going to say there's no example of it, but it's very rare. Certainly not the most common. Um, that's a late 20th century thing and mostly made up. It was inspired by television and by people like the Warrens, whose work I consider absolutely worthless. They were basically conservative Christians whose real goal was to make people afraid of metaphysics, which is why so many horror films are based on their work, because that's basically what they were writing. Um, so be careful of anything that comes from that point of view. If it looks like it belongs on the old TV series Friday the 13th, you probably shouldn't take it very seriously. You might enjoy it, it might be great entertainment, but it's not real metaphysics. Real metaphysics is a spiritual science, which should be no more frightening than any other kind of science. Not to say there's nothing to be careful of, as there could be in any form of science, but that's a different thing from being frightened of your shadow. And if someone is teaching about metaphysics from the point of view of being frightened of everything you deal with, they don't know what they're talking about. To start with, if they knew what they were talking about, they wouldn't need to be frightened. Now, Christine says, when I was working on my second degree, a bad storm brought part of a tree through my magic room. My mentor thought I might have created a vortex. Hearing that kind of scared me because I never intended such a thing and didn't want to believe that because, again, it wasn't an intention. Luckily, no one was hurt. Yeah, I don't know that I would agree with that. Now, certainly you did create a vortex. Whenever you're doing magic, you're creating a vortex, but that shouldn't be pulling a tree through your roof. Um, as I say, whenever we create a circle, we're creating a kind of vortex. It's just a small temporary one. A vortex is an energy center. In the end, that's all it really means. And in a manner of speaking, anything we do metaphysically um, does that. And hello to Zane in the chat room. It's good to see you, Zane. Um, and because everything that we do metaphysically, in a manner of speaking, works with a vortex, because we're gathering energy, um, it really should be a very common subject for us to be familiar with, something that's part of our everyday lives. We just don't usually think of it that way. When we talk about the energy centers of the Earth, they're much larger vortices because we'd expect them to be. The Earth is much larger than us. Um, it's also worth saying that the vortices of the Earth correspond to the chakras of the body in the sense of what they are, and the ley lines to the meridians of the body. And we'll be talking about that on Thursday. And you'll find that there is a lot of similarity because in the end, they're really the same things. And hello to Donna in the chat room. It's good to see you. Donna says, this is a great topic. and enjoying so many stories from everyone. And Jennifer says, "Thank you for the information. I already am following you all. I will definitely follow you closer. Thank you for acknowledging my comment." Absolutely, Jennifer. That's why we have the chat room. I love actually being able to talk to people. For about a decade, I did something called Reverend Don's Vlog, all of which are still visible um, in our Corellian TV archives. Used to be Magic TV, um, where I answered individual people's questions. But at that time, we didn't have this level of technology. So I couldn't speak to the people directly in the same way that we do now. I always loved doing the vlogs and answering questions um, through most of that time period. And it is something that we frequently find ourselves doing here. And hello to George in the chat room. It's good to see you, George. And hello to Vidi, Vidi Lalka in the chat room. It's good to see you. And yeah, I love seeing everyone here. I love getting to talk to everyone. And one of these days, George and I must get together. George is a friend from about the age of 6 years. We've known each other. I won't say how long. It's a long time. Uh, and since I'm back in the area, I'm hoping we can get together one day. And Donna says, "Will tomorrow's topic explain how I might be able to find ley lines that are close to me?" Tomorrow, I'm going to be interviewing High Priestess and author Sarah Hartsaw. So we won't be dealing with that tomorrow, but actually I can talk to you a little bit about that right now, even though we are coming down to the end of our half hour. Although if I happen to go a little bit over, it's not like anybody is going to stop me. Um, and George asked, "Did you go to kindergarten at Grant also?" I did not. Um, I started in first grade at Grant School. I went to kindergarten at the Salvation Army, of all places. Which of course is no longer there, like so many things from our youth. But going back to Donna's question, how might you find ley lines that are close to you? I'd go back to dowsing. Um, One of the ways to find a ley line is to dowse for it. And if you have no idea where to look, you might start with a map and a pendulum. To narrow down where you're looking for, you pass the pendulum over different parts of the map and ask, "Is this where you need to be looking?" It will tell you the general areas, and then you take your pendulum or your dowsing rods and you go to that area, and you can hunt down the location. You can also, if you're energetically sensitive, just look for it that way. Um, and you might also ask your guides to help lead you to it. Those are simple instructions on how to find ley lines that are close to you. And if we're talking about the yang ley lines, you'll usually find that there's a lot of activity around them. So it would not be uncommon to find them in highly populated areas or areas with historical significance. If you're talking more about the yin ley lines, that tends to be less the case. And and George says, yes, 6 years old it is then. And yes, we met in first grade, I believe, at Grant School here in Danville. And I remember that school very fondly. It haven't seen the inside of it, obviously, for a very long time. I believe it's still standing, but no longer a school. And I imagine if I saw it now, it would seem very, very small. Um, I find it interesting to realize how different things seemed when I was younger versus how they seem seeing them as an adult. I first realized that sometime in my early 20s, looking at the furniture in our home and realizing, I thought that cabinet was really tall. It's not. um, but it speaks to how our perception of things change as we change. And that's true both as we get older, but also as we grow. And our perception of things like metaphysics will get deeper as we work with it farther because our ability to perceive will change. But with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for joining me. And join me again tomorrow when we will be interviewing Sarah Hartsong. And again on Thursday, when we'll be talking about chakras and the meridians of the body. And we may possibly retouch some of this subject as well. And and Donna says, I'm a strong air element and earth guardian. Wow, I need to research more about those lines. Absolutely. And as I said very early in this broadcast, I highly encourage you not just to go by what I say, but to go out and do your own research. And I think you'll find that I generally know what I'm talking about. Um, Although it does depend where you're looking. If you're looking in pop sources, they're going to be more limited. And I mentioned, for example, the work of the Warrens, which I would consider a pop source and not a good one. But you will find that if you look at the more legitimate sources, the more traditional sources, you'll find that most of what I say is going to be what you're going to find when you do your own research. But still, it's good to do your own research. So with that, let us close with our prayer, as we always do, and I will see you tomorrow. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to continue to walk with us and guide us as we go forward and help us to integrate the energies of rebirth from this recent solar eclipse still further into our lives, bringing prosperity and good fortune to all of us. Help us also to align to the energies of the universe and the energies of the earth in the ways that bring us the most positive outcomes. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we rejoice in the understanding of the universe that you give to us. And we ask that you will always continue to lead us in joy, strength, and prosperity. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you. And knowing you're always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always, and we'll see you tomorrow.